So, good afternoon, everybody. Lots of you I know, but some of you I don't. And I'm Laura Mann from Frankly Green and Webb, and I am joined today by a colleague of mine from Frankly Green and Webb, Lindsey Green, and Michelle Grohe from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and Lawrence Chiles from the National Gallery in London. And as my slide says, this is moving from aspiration to action and changing the experience for first-time visitors. So, first, a quick introduction. These are the things we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you kind of the opening bracket of a little bit of framing for thinking about what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to hear from Lawrence about the National Gallery, from Michelle from the Isabella Stewart Gardner, and then Lindsey is going to wrap everything up in a fantastically digestible bow for us at the end, right? So as the title of our session suggests, this presentation is about both an audience, first-time visitors, and action, a process, working with those first-time visitors. So I'm going to take each of those, the audience and the process, in turn. So the first question really is, why first-time visitors? And so for the people from museums in the audience, are first-time visitors a category that you talk about in your museum, a segment of the audience that you actively think about and design for? Can I get a show of hands where that's a yes? Ooh, yeah, I sort of figured a reasonably small number. And so the question is, why is that? And because I think it's worth thinking about that when we consider first-time visitors, it's a pretty large group of people. At the National Gallery, 42% of their visitors are new to the museum and new to art. And at the National Gallery in London, that translates to 2.8 million people. And at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, 65% plus of their visitors are coming to the museum for the first time. So this is a large group of people we're talking about here. And yet, we often don't consider them in designing products and services and opportunities and experiences at our museums. And in the research that we've done with a number of different institutions, we've seen that first-time audiences are more likely to be less frequent museum visitors, unfamiliar with the topics that our museums cover, and unfamiliar with us, that is, the structure of our museum, what it might offer them, the kind of experience that they might have. And so unsurprisingly, first-time visitors are, at least in what we've seen, consistently the group of people, or a group of people, having a hard time in museums, but they're also potentially one of the easiest groups to help. And beyond the numbers that we see today in terms of first-time visitors, they are, I think, in many respects, the future of museums. And because I don't even need this slide, right? Like, this is, everybody sitting in this audience has thought about this in one form or another, right? That the future vitality of what we all do and the institutions we all work for and with depends on new audiences. And that means both the people who aren't coming now and groups of people who historically have not been big museum goers. And so, and you only need to look at the changing demographics of the United States to get one example of that, which is there are certainly underserved communities, minority populations, lots and lots of different groups of people who attend museums in lower proportions to their proportion in the general population. And that is the subject of many other sessions and in part the keynote yesterday. But I think the number, in 2044, the US will become a majority minority country. And so it's incumbent upon us to not only work to bring new audiences to museums, but also to deliver for them when they actually get there. And so part of our interest in delivering for first-time visitors is about focusing attention on this audience and thinking about how we might design products, services, and experiences for that group. And just to sort of reinforce this, all of us in this room, we are not this audience. And I think by and large, museums design products, services, and experiences for mostly ourselves and the things we know and love, but also the things we take for granted. And so if we, switching gears just a minute in terms of why have this session at MCN? Because so far I've said a lot about an audience, but I haven't said very much at all about digital or technology or things that MCN kind of conventionally focuses on. And I think that the frame for us is that digital today in museums is less about what is technologically possible and more about making choices, about what will deliver for our audiences and on the objectives of our institutions. It used to be that digital and technology museums was a lot about what you actually could make. But today, there's an enormous number of things that you could make. So the question is, what will you make or design and why? You're going to hear from two museums in a moment, and both of them were starting from a particular perspective, which is how might we make digital products and services that are more audience-centered. And so that's the envelope here. That's why this is a session at MCN. And for us, thinking about the visitor designing digital products and services, I think, frankly, Green & Webb has a real bias towards visitor-centered approaches and the visitor experience. And so from our perspective, designing digital products and services starts with seeing through the visitor's eyes and understanding what the visitor experience actually looks like. And I would say that increasingly, it's clear that designing something digital and delivering it successfully is dependent upon a whole suite of non-digital things. And we'll post our slides so that if you don't want to take pictures of these, you don't have to. But looking at the colored dots here, those represent different departments within a museum that might have domain over all of these elements that go into making your digital product or service a success. And so thinking about designing and delivering digital things for visitors is dependent in large part upon non-digital staff and requires kind of by definition a cross-departmental process. And so that's part of what you're going to hear about on the process side of these presentations and how people came together from across the museum to design new kinds of digital offers to meet the needs of those first-time visitors. So what you're going to hear about is that kind of audience-centered approach for first-time visitors, so one approach, one audience, but two quite different organizations and two quite different outcomes. And so with that, I want to invite Lawrence to come up here. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Laura. Hello. The National Gallery. You've all heard of it, right? Yeah, maybe? I don't know. So where are we? The National Gallery in London. Yeah, heart of London, in Trafalgar Square. If you haven't been there, you should go. It's rather amazing. And we are the story of European art, masterpiece by masterpiece, collected and cared for the nation's paintings and share them with the world. That's new, that bit of brand speak there, because we're just going the process of our tone and voice, and I'm testing that out, so it'd be good to know what you think about that. Does it come across as warm, friendly? We've got over 2,300 works of art, very focused collection, and a lot of deep knowledge and expertise. So what did we do? So the new digital services program, as Laura says, it's got digital in the title, but essentially it was not just about being digital. It was a whole program of work looking at our brand identity, the digital designs that we might make, and the wayfinding across the organisation. But prior to starting the actual program, we did do a set of two sort of reports, one on our technology and looking at the spaghetti that is our technology, and it was awful. But that kind of was helping us map out what we're going to do over the next 3 years in terms of digital. But the key point for this talk really is about this segmented audience and kind of what we did there. And the work we did with that gave us 4 main profiles, 70% of the audience. The objective of the new digital services program was to look at the personal art journey, how we're going to grow the engagement and connect with people with art. We took that segmentation piece of work and worked with 3 partners, Frankie Green and Webb, Fabrique in the audience here as well, and applied wayfinding. And those 3 partners helped us start to look at all this data and trying to decide how we're going to move forward. And as Laura mentioned, out of the 6.5 million people that come through our door, we identified that about 2.8 million people were new to the gallery and new to art. So how did that kind of break down over the 4 segments that we have? So we have our young British adults, our European adults, our New World sightseers, and British over 60s. We haven't left the British over 60s. We still care about them. They matter to us. They really do. Welcome. You're our core audience. But though that audience really sort of knows us, loves us, they come all the time, they want change, all the evidence show that they're keen for change. But we didn't really need to address them because they know about us and they know what to do with us. So the young British adults was a really surprising bit of the segmentation work, because we found out that actually people were coming from the 18 to 35-year-old group, but actually we were doing nothing to support them. So as it says on the slide, they were less confident about art, lack of affinity with art or the gallery, and they're less familiar with the gallery in its entirety. So it's a really big segment of people, and how can we work with them? So we took that opportunity, we looked at the market and who we're targeting, and we decided, well, how are we going to engage with these people and how we can move that into a design process to really find out what products and services we can do to support that group. I love this slide. This is brilliant. So another part of the work that Applied Wayfinding did was to look at how people navigate the gallery and how those 6.5 million people get around. So this was a bit of memory mapping that we did, and as you can see, how to work out what we have. Well, there's all Jesus this way. We might have a Van Gogh down here, and there's some flowers and things, and where's the toilet? So it's a marvelous slide that actually really helped us articulate the problem, one, about the physical space, but also how people get around us and what they're actually looking for. And a lot of people probably know about one particular painting, and that's it. This is a great slide as well because it actually went up to the trustees as part of a lot of presentations. So to hear that audience sort of voice and to hear that problem went right up to the top of the tree, which is great. It's a really shame, actually. I don't have the name of the person that did this because I really want to credit them. So other kind of hearing the voices about what we're doing and kind of like how we get to people. These 2 quotes are really interesting because I think they really come across as that kind of apologetic, guilt-ridden tone of voice from our audience, is that they feel that they should know, but they're sorry that they don't, and how can we really help them get across into the gallery, into the experience, and to really feel that they're empowered to walk around the space. So what do we actually do? We, over the course of a very short time frame, did 1 key real design and content sprint. So if anybody doesn't know sprints, agile process, we had 3 days of key people across the organisation in a room, which is all very new to them, and we spent those 3 days really thrashing out exactly what it was going to mean to these audiences to provide services for them. It was an eye-opener for a lot of people in the gallery. They were going out and testing ideas that they thought were going to be the best in the world. The phrase, "we killed our darlings," is really key because people would realise that a lot of things they were thinking about just wouldn't work, and it was having that immediacy on the gallery floor was really important. We did the journey mapping to kind of find the pain points and all that sort of stuff. So the light bulb moments that we got out of that were that, people know us, but they don't know our story. They might know a painting, but they don't really know where to go next. Language is a huge barrier. So 65% of our audience are overseas, and a massive proportion of that, English is not their first language. And they're unsure what questions to ask. So during this whole process, we did actually try and design some stuff. Thank you very much, Fabrique. And we did sort of end up with a suite of things. About 15 core ideas come out of this. And so these were really just concepts about how we might move these things forward. I won't go into them in too much detail, but they're all about kind of how you move people through the gallery to find the next painting or how they might plan their journey better. Essentially, everyone wants a map, and that has to be part of everything we do now. So what the next steps is, this slide is really important because we had a bit of a problem. All the initial kind of work we did, the audience was really at the heart of what we did. It was kind of finding out those needs and addressing them fundamentally. Everyone bought into that idea because it's kind of around servicing people in the gallery. When we had gone through the final process of presenting a lot of this work back, we did another content sprint, but looking really at kind of how we might deal with some of the themes of the collection and how we might bring that into a sprint process to create some new ideas. And that became problematic. It was sort of after a big sort of set of presentations, a big gap between the two processes. And as soon as we started talking about the collection itself, the audience was lost in that process. And the audience became the secondary decision-making point, really, rather than still being there as a primary thing about what their needs were. So it was in there, it worked, we got some ideas out of it, but it was a bit of, for the organisation, I think for the participants across the organisation, slightly more disappointing in that the action was not kind of clear there and there wasn't really a mandate for doing what we needed to do. But what was the overall outcome? So it was a very detailed, long project. It was sort of 7 months of actually doing the work, but 2 years of the planning. But overall, the project has really influenced the next 2 years of where we're going to go. The audience segmentation work has been embedded across the organisation. Everyone knows those segments now. They're all thinking about them. We're corporate planning with them. A key thing in the process was this brand tone of voice. And whilst we were doing all of the content sprints and thinking about the audience, when it came to making stuff, because the organisation hadn't really changed its brand tone of voice, that was a problem, I think, for everyone in terms of how they were going to make things. Thankfully, we've gone through another process to sort that out, and that brand tone of voice is now being rolled out. So I think the process will start to become quicker. One thing I forgot to mention as part of the whole process is that the content strategy that came out of the work we were doing was all around episodes and how to serve content to people in really bite-sized chunks so you can move them on to the next process, the next part of their journey. And that kind of way of thinking was really brought into at the top level, which is great. So that content strategy is moving forward. Audience focused and thinking about the audience is now really, really embedded in the organisation. I think we're moving on to new things in terms of how we're reshaping the team, and the structure of the team has now been changed to really think about our audience and insight as part of that structure. How we then start thinking about the digital journey across the organisation. So all those things, even though we may not have made anything at the end, the concepts that were there and the sort of key building blocks that have been there as part of the organisation are really going to help us over the next 3 years. Thank you.
Any questions?
Okay. And then while Michelle gets set, I'm going to ask.
You're going to grill me.
I'm going to pose some gentle, kind questions to Lawrence about, given the process that you guys just went through, what was most valuable about that?
Navel gazing, kind of really looking at us, exactly who we are as an organisation. I think the fact that we'd attempted to do something that was looking at the brand identity and digital designs and wayfinding as one thing was an amazing thing to do. And I think the organisation really had to work hard in that. Can you hear me? Oh no, you put your hand up, Caroline. Sorry. Oh. Wait.
Yes, wait, sorry. We're going to, okay, a quick one.
Who drove that process at the gallery?
So it came out of, the structure as it was during the process is that this was all coming out of the comms team. And it was brought into at the top, so that was great. So our director was all behind it, but it was coming out of the comms team, which had its own kind of problems in terms of it seemed to be a comms delivered thing. So, yeah.
And on the flip side, what would you do differently next time?
I wouldn't do it all in one go. As I said at the end, the kind of the building blocks that we're left with are great, but if we'd have had those at the beginning of a design process, that would have been even better. So I think elongating that bit of work where we jump straight from doing the segmentation work to then straight into doing this sort of design process was crazy for everybody. And we hadn't got that embedded across the participants who were kind of, the staff who were working on the design sprints. And so if they'd come armed with a lot more of those things in their mind and kind of really got to grips with it, then the process would have been a lot better.
Okay. Thank you. Michelle, you're up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to adjust this so I'm not
bending over the whole time. Hi, I'm Michelle Grohe. I'm Associate Curator of Education at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And just to explain a little bit about the Gardner Museum, it's named after the founder, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and she had a vision for her museum to recreate the feeling of being in Venice, Italy, while you were in Boston, Massachusetts. So from the outside of the building, it actually, and I think a lot of times when people think about the Gardner Museum, we have the historic segment, or we often call it the Palace, which is shown here, and then we have a more modern wing that opened in 2012. But I think that the historic building and her vision for the museum is really what resonates with a lot of our visitors, or why they're told to go to the Gardner Museum. And just a couple of things I wanted to highlight really quickly. So Isabella Stewart Gardner collected artwork and pieces of architecture to build her museum, and then she arranged it in a very personal way. There are no labels throughout the museum, so nothing is identified to tell you what it is. And it doesn't follow a typical art historical or stylistic way of installation. And as you can see on the right, there's some lighting challenges that happen in our museum. She really wanted you to feel like you were in Venice, Italy, late 19th century, so before electricity was installed in a lot of those palazzos. And our museum is also unique in that the collection is permanently displayed. So when Mrs. Gardner died, she said we cannot change, add to, or remove anything permanently from our galleries. So low light actually helps with preservation of the collection, but there's a lot happening in our galleries. We also, just to get it out of the way, we're the site of a major art theft in 1990. No, we do not know where the artworks are right now. Yes. Call Christina Nielsen if you know. And so we have a lot going on. And then on the left, I just have a picture of what we refer to as our living room, which is like an orientation space where you can learn a little bit about the museum. It's also one of the only spaces where visitors can sit comfortably throughout their visit. So I just want to give that context. So what did and I wanted to talk a little bit for first-time visitors. So as Laura mentioned, we have about 65% of our visitors are first-timers. In the summer, it actually shoots a little bit past 70, like 72, 73%. And there's very little to help you as you make your way through the museum. We do a lot of things with what we call human interpretation, but there's a lot of confusion about who is Mrs. Gardner, why does this stuff look this way, and what am I supposed to do with it? So when we worked with Frankly Green and Webb and worked on journey mapping, that was about a year ago, and we worked with representatives from many different departments, and we took a close look at existing data that we had about audiences, really tried to get a sense of first-time visitors' needs, what we were doing well, what we could do better. Think very carefully, because at this time we were planning two major digital projects. One was the redesign of our website, which we worked with Fabrique on, and the other was piloting a mobile audio guide that we worked with for a little while with Detour. And so thinking really carefully about what do first-time visitors need for both of those things. So we took a closer look at a couple key audiences, both those that were coming and those that we were aspiring to get more of. So we ended up working on 4 different personas, 2 of which were looking at kind of visitors who are already coming, so that tends to skew a little bit older, and 2 that were looking at younger visitors, both those that had come and those who had not. So here you see just some action shots of us working through that journey mapping from planning what you did during your visit and then afterwards. So out of that process, we looked at the different, looking at data that we collected from visitors, taking a closer look at personas. We then created a visitor journey map that tracks entry to exit. And as you can see, we have one green circle, yay, that's our central courtyard in the historic building. And then we have a couple pain points, and I'm gonna talk about that in a second. I also wanted to point out there's the kind of zigzag that goes up and down right next to the green circle, which that's when they're in the historic building. So there's some highs and lows, highs and lows. You're having fun, but I don't know what I'm doing. What is that? I'm not sure. There's a lot of that. How am I supposed to use this thing you just handed me? There's a lot happening. So this was really helpful as we started to move forward and think together in cross-departmental way about how we're going to solve some of this. So the first thing that came out of this was what we call the VX, or Visitor Experience Team. So it's made up of representatives from many different departments. We also have a link to our senior management through a group called the Steering Committee, which has members of senior management, as well as myself and the head of our Visitor Services team that work collaboratively. So basically, it's a way to phone a friend or phone leadership when you need them to be aware of what's going on within the museum. We also created a definition of what is visitor experience at the Gardner Museum, which, and I want to we worked on what does that mean for visitors, what does that mean for us internally, and then at the bottom, really trying to integrate this new way of thinking for the museum, which wasn't within our silos of our department, but really working collaboratively together in new ways. So that last line in bold of we are working on designing an integrated and holistic service where physical, human, and digital work together. So even though this was kicked off with 2 digital projects, we really started to see the impact in many different ways with the visitor experience. We also, out of working through journey mapping and thinking about different types of visitors, we came up with what we call our visitor experience principles, and we worked with Laura and Lindsey to think carefully about what would a good visit look like, what would success look like. So things like, can you get from the entrance to the art relatively quickly? Can you find your way around the museum? Are you able to pause and recharge both yourself and your phone or another device that you might need to? And then I want to talk really briefly. So we have the visitor experience team that meets monthly, and we work on different, so kind of similar to what Lawrence was describing, like these discrete projects that we work on kind of quickly and then build them on each other. So one of them was the mobile audio guide, which you see on the left here. So we created a 16-minute introductory immersive walk where it starts you in that orientation space I showed you earlier, the living room, and takes you, just push play, and the curator of our collection, Christina Nielsen, takes you around on a walk with Isabella and explains who she was. It hits all of those things that we talked about before. Visitors need to know who Mrs. Gardner was, why it looks this way, how should I interact with this museum, what things am I allowed to touch, and which things am I going to get tackled if I touch them. So things like that that really just give the visitor a framework for their visit. We also started collecting data in various ways. One of the staff that interact with visitors the most are our security guards, and we hear a lot that they get asked a lot of questions. However, they're trained to not go into a lot of detail when they answer those questions. So part of it for us is we spent a week, including over a weekend, collecting just write down every single question that you're asked. And where you're stationed at that time. So we took a look at that data to figure out where visitors were asking questions and what they needed, which was really interesting to help then develop tools both for our staff as well as what visitors might need and where that need might take place. And then also, like I said, digital was only one part of improving the visitor experience for us. We started, and these are all things that we were aware of before, but now we had a team and a structure to start thinking about these things, to start problem solving together. We're really popular right now. We're at record high attendance, which means long lines outside. Winter is coming, so is rain and sleet and snow. So what are we going to do when that happens? And so thinking about line activation outdoors. We're currently updating our CRM, working with Tessatura, so we're taking a close look at ticketing and signage when you come into the lobby. One of the major pain points was you get an admission ticket when you can't come in, but then you need to get it scanned again halfway through your visit. A lot of visitors, they don't know where they put it. So we changed from printing admission tickets to tags that you would wear during your visit. And my favorite is we give you the rules of engagement, but these are all rules of what not to do on the sign on the right. So don't eat, take flash photography, talk on your phone, or bring your backpacks. So we have to work on spinning that a little more positively. But it is helpful, just what do visitors need to know when they enter into some of our spaces. And then lastly, we're working on, so like I said, we started this project thinking about 2 digital projects. One was redesigning our website, and then the other was a mobile audio guide. Now going back to those again and thinking really carefully, where should the mobile audio guide live? What can we actually, so we started with a discrete pilot, and now what does that look like if we were to take that to scale? And also, a lot of the work on the website initially was thinking about what was happening for visitors as they were preparing to come, and now we're taking a closer look at how visitors, our staff and volunteers are using our mobile responsive website when they're on site, and what adjustments might we have to take because of that, and what questions do they still have that we might need to answer. And I have one last slide. Am I doing okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. That's because educators, we like to talk fast, right? So, and then for what's next, a couple things that we're working on. We actually are taking a really hard look at a lot of what we call the human component of our visitor experience. What's going on with staff and volunteers? So working collectively, all of our frontline managers, so the manager for cafe, gift store, visitor services, and security, are all coming together to talk about what's a consistent training that every new person in one of those departments coming on board needs in order to interact with the public. Eventually that will become a training for all new staff, but we're starting with those that are going to interact with the public more frequently. We're doing what we call a human interpretation audit. We recently changed our public tours that we offer for visitors. We cut them in half. They used to be an hour. Now they're half an hour long, but they happen more frequently. So thinking, are we setting up visitors for success to know how to navigate on their own once they go through that shorter program? Taking a closer look at website use, and then we're thinking ahead about how we could still collect data about our visitors and how to integrate digital throughout all of our work through a digital task force as well. So that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead. I will. Okay. So Michelle, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Lawrence.
It's like the hot seat.
Yes, exactly. Which is, what was the most valuable aspect of this process?
Yeah, I think for the Gardner, it was really that staff buy-in that resulted, because a lot of employees that didn't have an opportunity to first interact with each other or to frankly have their voice heard with what their interaction or daily work is like, I think has really started to build a really great sense of community as well as interest in what the visitor experience is like.
Mm-hmm. And what would you do differently next time?
There's so much. I'm just kidding. I think that I think we could have spent a little bit more time framing what we were about to do and thinking about the visitor experience a little bit more. And I think that's something the Gardner could have done, where we could have shared more of that data we already had and reminded everyone about some of the data that we already knew about both visitors who were coming and those that were not, and why we were. So it wasn't just these digital initiatives, but we knew a lot of things about visitors and, a little bit of a roadmap of what that might lead us to do. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Lindsey, you're up.
Okay. I'm going to do just a bit of reflection. I'm kind of hoping, just before after an advert where they tell you exactly what happened in the previous two parts of the episode that you've already watched. I'm really hoping to avoid that. So if I veer into that station, please put your hand up, tell me to shut up. So what did we actually learn through this? So this is, as Laura mentioned, we were talking about one approach, one particular audience, two different organizations and two different outcomes. I'm going to put a little bit of context on that, because actually we've done some more of this work with other organizations, and I have to say the first time audience, that profile, is the one that comes up the most with that, because quite often we're asking an organization to narrow the scope of try not to focus on delivering everything for everybody straight away, and quite often then the conversation becomes about who is the most valuable audience to focus on right now. And first-time audiences universally are the group that come up. So it is an area that has been targeted more and more. So I just want to talk a bit about what we know about first-time audiences based on both the stuff that we've done with the National Gallery and the Gardner, but also a few other organizations. And look, there is like a universal set of common insights that we're getting. So hopefully it will give you a bit of meat to take away with you. The challenge is that by default, we're designing for people who are basically have a deep understanding of your organization. There is assumptions that they have a knowledge of the topic, and that there is a really good understanding of how museums work, that they have that side of them. And I have to say, universally, if we're talking about that to people, that is the people who are in the room at the museum. Those are the definitions of them. And kind of the perception of the levels that they assume is way higher. They're looking at people who maybe have less knowledge than them, but it's a lot less knowledge. And that's one of the first surprises that comes about. And first-time visitors universally are almost like the other end of the scale than audiences. And I have to say the impact of that is that as organizations, we are not meeting the needs of first-time visitors, and this is universally reflected on the number of people that are coming back. We're seeing in the UK, people are returning, but the number of people who are returning is getting smaller, but the number of times they come is getting bigger. So technically, we're delivering for a smaller and smaller audience. Not depressing at all. So one of our big things that we're looking at the moment is, why does that keep happening? Why are we building this in? And that assumption of we're designing for ourselves comes with it an inherent problem, which is that we start to design what we call friction into the visitor experience. And it's that idea that basically, like when you speak to an audience, as Lawrence suggested earlier, they'll say, we had a great time, it was brilliant. And then you say, oh, great, and was there any problems? Well, I didn't understand this, but obviously, you know, it's not for someone like me. This place is for somebody with better knowledge, you know. And I should have checked the plan before I came, but I didn't check the plan because I didn't have time. And there's like a universal set of reasons that they give that they've not performed very well. So the great news is that we're making people feel like they didn't perform very well. And then we're making them work harder and harder to try and navigate these spaces. And the friction that is caused, there is several impacts of that. There is the cognitive load, the constant worrying about whether you're going in the right direction, whether what you're looking at, kind of some of the stuff that Michelle talked about is highs and lows. Yay, oh, I don't understand. Those kind of things are constant friction. And what you start to see is there is a burden where people aren't taking in the kind of content that the museum want to deliver. There is a reinforcement that this isn't very pleasurable, it's hard work. And though perhaps, you know, if I'm looking at spending my weekend, perhaps this is a hard way to spend my weekend. And then there also, what we see is a serendipity in the design. So where first-time visitors are taken into consideration, there isn't robust touch points that they will come across. So the green, aha, I'm in the palace moment that you saw from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, that is because everybody goes through that moment. That is the reason that you're there. But a lot of other organizations and what we've seen is, like you saw that the ecology that we saw with all the different colors on it, like if one of those parts of the chain is not performing very well, then there is a chance that people won't come across something that actually would have made or break their visit. They're not coming across things that are really important to them, or that they would have found something really relevant really easily. So we're not creating a robust system in terms of visitor experience. And I have to say, universally, technology has come from a perspective of, you know, we're all wanting to do a good job. We're all wanting to make this a democratic space. And the democratic space has been about giving access to everybody with lots more information. But if you look at the needs of these audiences, it's not that they need more information, it's actually that they need relevant information. And that you'll commonly hear, oh, well, I would have liked to know more about this. What we're interpreting that is, well, I would have liked to hear something that was actually more relevant to me. It's just you're not covering it. And so what we're starting to understand more and more is that basically by just giving pure access to information, we're burdening that cognitive load even more. And we're reinforcing that idea that you're going to have to do the hard work to figure out which bit's most relevant for you. Quite a lot of first-time visitor service experiences are buried slightly. You know, the audio guide desk is around the corner. The map, you're going to have to go to the information desk if you want to know where X is. So there is an embedded in the design when we're sometimes trying to make these spaces look clean and really beautiful and really easy to understand, that the assumption is those bits are the bits that people have to work for to find. So these aren't things that are happening every single organization. I'm not the voice of doom and gloom, but what you see is many of these things come into play at different organizations. And so one of the things that technology can start to do is, rather than make more of that burden, is to start to actually address some of those challenges. And so for first-time audiences, episodic thinking was around the idea of scaffolding, understanding of a topic, and also building skills to use the museum. That idea, I think it was the Cleveland Museum of Art, we're talking about their Art Lens space, which is about people getting to understand the skills of looking and skills of understanding art. Those are key things that people just don't currently own. So that idea of focusing on skills rather than knowledge, tools to navigate, tools to orientate yourself, not particularly find your way around, but understand the physical collection. It starts here and it ends here. It's all Jesus, and then it's Dutch flowers. That's what the new signage says, right? You know, wouldn't it be lovely if we kind of freed ourselves a little bit? But so that idea of scaffolding people's understanding that, you know, the flat stuff, the flowery stuff, that kind of thing. There is an opportunity for digital to start kind of scaffolding that and building skills through interaction rather than information. There is, we're starting to see this more and more, the idea of giving people decision-making points that are relevant to them. So for this one, it was the Van Gogh Museum. This idea that people were talking about, well, I'd like to take some kind of tour, but, you know, I want to do it at my own pace. I don't want people to tell me. So when we worked on this, those lines were tested to make sure that they resonated with audiences and they understood what those were going to be. I want to discover with my family. I want to see highlights. Those were all terms that were tested. And then the I don't get it, this is from the SF MoMA Detour app. We did a recent piece of evaluation, and there was a moment of an audience member saying, I didn't get it. And then it said to me, you know, I don't get it. And the moment where they kind of had that connection where the voice on the mobile experience totally mimicked theirs, their internal thinking, which was a slight element of shame and attached to it as well, was a real moment of acknowledgement that they were in the building, that something was being created for them. And then this is by We Are Curious, which is a rebranding of a science museum in Bristol in the UK. And this is their manifesto. And I think what we commonly see is a lot of people, you'll have probably heard it through sessions through the last 2 days, but that idea of being transparent about what permissions are available and not. But I think there's something that we default to, which is giving text-based information of permissions, visual information. And there's a lot that can be communicated through digital experiences that demonstrate your values. That was the core of what Lawrence was talking about, was this idea of you have your brand values. What digital experiences could actually deliver those brand values? I think a lot of talk about the Cooper Hewitt pen for many years, but I think one of the most interesting things to me was the amount of permission that was given to every single visitor who walked through the door, that here is an object that we're giving to you, the perception is for free, and that we welcome you to interact with our space and we give you permission to play in our space. That's a really strong message. It's a subtle message. It's not written in big words, but the demonstration and the interaction is delivering that kind of message. I think digital technologies in particular have an opportunity to look at the interaction, that's the message for interaction rather than the message of literal text, which, you know, anybody who's trying to get a sign put up on a wall knows the challenge of that. And so that's the audience, and I now want to just flip through to the process again, go back to where we are. And I have to say, audience-centered design and the approach that we've taken has got common things just embedded, baked into the process that we're using, that it will deliver kind of universally, and we've seen it time and time again. And that's about building, people building a deeper knowledge of and more nuanced understanding of a target audience across the organization. You start to hear people using the same language, and if you're lucky, they start naming specific audience members that you've been talking about. Oh yeah, Kevin would love that kind of thing. So then the second one that we get is use as a digital department who's starting this. Quite often, what's happening is other departments are starting to get a deeper understanding of what digital can, but also, more importantly, what it can't do without their input. The idea of installing something that then basically has to live and die on its own and can't do that is really important. And one of my the bits that makes my heart sing is quite often we're reconnecting colleagues with audiences, and I think sometimes people have going and talking to an actual person in the gallery, like, is food for thought. It inspires people to do their job, because I know that everybody who's in this room is coming to kind of have an impact on their audiences, and sometimes we forget to stand there face to face with them. But I have to say the impact of this kind of work, what we're seeing universally, is that it is limited, and it's limited by a set of things that we're seeing, and that's around the shape of organizations and the way organizations are currently working. And that is that we have a complexity and a permission issue. There are significant challenges around doing this in a really constructive, productive way that basically look at kind of navigating this complexity and this permission. And I know a lot of organizations where the only way they can get something done is to kind of keep your head down, do what you can do, hopefully it'll get through the process and you'll have something brilliant at the end of it. But this kind of cross-departmental, big strategic approach, you can't do that, and therefore you kind of have some really big problems built into it. So my piece of advice after several false starts and some difficult conversations is the idea of getting a mandate and a budget to solve the problem, not for a product. And that problem must be an audience problem. It must be articulated as an audience problem. You just got loads of data about first-time audiences and how important they are. Use that to kind of navigate and discuss having a mandate to solve a problem. Don't talk about we need to improve the website for first-time visitors. Talk about visitors need support to prepare for their visit. Talk about how that could look like. We're very used to commissioning an end product and getting a budget that has a value for solving a problem. That is universally a way that could free up some of the problems that we see. We need to develop skills and tools to critically evaluate ideas. One of the big things that happened in both of these and have happened to other ones is that, like, the inspiration of connecting with audiences generates a huge amount of ideas. And the killing of your darlings, the kind of the moment where you say, actually, this failed, it's not so much of a problem when you're stood eyeball to eyeball with an audience member. They go, I have no idea what you're talking about, or I can't see me needing that. There's a moment where people go, oh, that's really disappointing, but they're quite happy to let go of the idea. The problem is when there's an idea that's generated that works for the audience, but it doesn't quite work for the organization, either through budget or through what something should be doing. It's not kind of on brand. And I think if we're going for this more audience approach, we need those skills and we need those tools that's going to help us to critically evaluate ideas and make them robust before they go up to senior management or before they get released. There is an obvious one, which is, and this is the Juggernaut of Exhibitions. Basically, we work in organizations that have lots to deliver constantly through the year. There is no perfect moment to kind of doing this work. And the problem is like, you know, some people enjoy closing down for 5 years and getting the chance to really focus in on their audience and do all this kind of stuff. But for the majority of organizations, this is changing the wheels of the bus while it's still going. So I think one of the big things to think about before you start about these kind of projects is to create an environment where colleagues can prioritize and focus on the audience. I'm not saying it's easy, because this just keeps going. But I do recognize that when you have that moment, you can create a lot more momentum than when you're running sessions and, you know, someone's got to drop out for 3 weeks because they're going on an event or something like that. And so there's a few insights there into the process and the audience, but I started as a kind of an idea is like, what does this actually mean for the future of audience-centered museums? Like, how we've got this aspiration, lots of people are talking about being more visitor-centered and being more audience-centered. What does that actually look like when we're addressing what are very big and challenging problems that are baked into our organization and in conflict with the process? And so I think we think of products, our museum's products, as the permanent collection or exhibitions. And when you're more visitor-orientated, possibly the natural progression is to start think of the product as the visitor experience. And thinking about kind of having different audiences access those different products. So you're developing a product the visitor experience for the first-time audience. You already have it probably for members. You possibly already have it for school groups. This isn't a new model, but it's the idea of taking a more, what would be seen as a generic audience and really specializing on that. And our organizations, as they're set up at the most to deliver exhibitions and permanent collections, this is what they currently look like. And as I mentioned, kind of getting all those ducks in a row, getting a chain and a process and a system which is robust enough to kind of keep delivering on audience-centered approach, that's really difficult. The chains break really, really easily, particularly in organizations that are overstretched and under-resourced. So I think one of my thoughts was, how do you make this more possible? And I have to say, my thought at the moment is, so what would it really look like if you had a product manager who was for the first-time visitor experience? What would it look like if you had a multi-skilled team whose entire job was to look after the first-time visitor experience, and that you were managing it in that process? And the value is that you, A, have the focus, but you also have the opportunity to keep that data coming back and back into the into the team to keep informing things. It's a process that's been used in commercial organizations. We're seeing a lot more of them taking that view that an owner is an owner of the visitor, the user experience, or a particular user experience. I think that's a really interesting question. I can't imagine how that would happen at the moment, because it would mean letting go of a lot of things. And so that at the moment is my personal tension. How do we move to this aspiration of audience-centered design? Okay.
So I think we've got about 7 minutes for audience questions. Yes.
I love what you said, and obviously, and I think there's a couple of other things. I think the buy-in at the top of the organisation, the understanding of what you're actually talking about, is missing right now. And so anybody trying to do this in an organisation, it's so difficult, because like many things that we've had to do with digital people, we're trying to change without really the authority to do it. So many of these areas are contested areas in our museums in terms of who manages them: education, digital services, digital marketing, membership. It goes on and on and on. And so I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about, that's the kind of big, that's the landscape, that's the reality of our landscape, whether you're in a small, medium or large museum, the complexity is there. Do you have any thoughts about, how do we start to break this down, so that, that we're able to demonstrate that actually this is a way that we need to start thinking? In 2 minutes.
No. I think it's the ultimate challenge, and the problem is I think testing that would be really interesting. I honestly, there is a part of me. A lot of what we do is big and strategic, and what I recognize is that you can go into an organization and you can help change things, but there's only a very small snapshot where you change those things, and then actually the project will stall because it will come across the might of exhibitions or the might of the permanent collection or whatever. I think looking at a question, like an audience question, and kind of almost setting that seed of the process of what does that look like, and saying, well, like, can we pick off a reasonable, knotty challenge that we can actually say, this is the scale of the issue, this is the value of solving that problem, whether it's, first-time visitors, the big thing to develop with first-time visitors is to develop trust, is to get them to trust you as an organization, that they keep returning because they start to take more risk with you, and they'll come to things that they may not have come to you before. They'll become members where they may not have become before, and it's actually about managing risk and relationship in that way. I think just kind of those are big issues, and they cover a lot of departments. Kind of seeing how you could scale it down, I think, would be the only option, I think. But yeah, I think it's a big challenge. I'm interested in how you could hijack members or schools, because they're already in that model to a degree. They just don't tend to have the value and the structure of all the different departments working in their team in that way. They're still suffering with everybody being all over the place as well. I wonder if anybody else.
I think I was going to counter your question with another, your problem with another problem, because I think for us, I know it's very British, isn't it? It's very good. No, I think for us in particular, the problem stems from the fact that the argument is that they'll come anyway. So why address this audience? And we get 6.5 million people through the door every year, and that doesn't change. So why do we need to do anything? But I think it goes back to what Lindsey says, is trying to demonstrate that value through data. Yeah. And that's the only way you can do it, is to say, if we're chasing membership, then we need more, to convert those people. How do we do that? And we know that our audiences are coming, but they're dropping off. So we have to address this issue, because people will tick the box. I've come, I've visited, I've done the National Gallery, but we don't want them to lose them. We can't lose them, because the audiences are dwindling.
I think what Lindsey said and what Lawrence said is the question of the strategic objectives of the institution. Like, where is the institution going in, and what is important to the senior most management, the director, the trustees? In other words, what are the business issues in play here in terms of the future of the institution? And I think to the extent that addressing some of these questions, designing for some of these audiences, solving some of these problems, can be directly linked to the larger strategic direction of where the organization is going, then and measured against that, as in, we're trying to solve this problem because it reflects this particular organizational strategy, and here's how we're going to measure it to demonstrate whether it did or not. I think those kinds of levels of concrete goals are what create kind of legitimacy and trust at the senior management level. And to some degree, I think some of the departmental collaboration and working across silos has to be done as skunkworks projects. Do you know what I mean? You do it, a skunkworks project is something that literally flies under the radar. It's something that isn't official, that is, because I think that's the way that sometimes you have to make change.
Questions? Have you ever seen any good strategies about addressing rotating exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, for first-time visitors, after they're through the door, after they've gotten through the website, through the door? We have permanent collection that doesn't change, and that's one thing to invest in a way of getting first-time visitors acclimated to it, but we do, for rotating exhibitions, make up the majority of our gallery spaces, but we don't have any strategy for what a visitor needs going into that. Have you seen anything like that?
I think I haven't seen anything kind of really targeted at first-time visitors and exhibitions. I think it depends what your programming is more than anything. Interesting, we worked in this way with a performance company, a ballet company actually. There is a correlation in terms of they put on a performance 3 times a year and they have to keep people going. And the insights were similar. The brand name worked as a hygiene factor, so people kind of felt secure. They evaluated the experience based on whether it delivered something that was familiar to them. So could you make that relevant link for them, even if they're not totally familiar with the subject matter? And that they're interested in a level of familiarity, narrative, spectacle, all of those kind of things that could hook them in for the first time. But it was the idea of a really firm welcome that was like, you're here, we're really pleased that you're here, we're going to make sure that you're at the level, because even though people came through the door of those kind of performances, what they realized is, again, the level of knowledge that they had to interpret what they were looking at. They were good cultural consumers. They did like lots of stuff. It's just they didn't have lots and lots of different hooks. And what we found with the people who went and never came back was that they had less cultural consumption. That was the defining principle. Possibly through stage of life, like they've got kids, they had no time. It was possibly to do with money, but a lot of it was to do with like how many hooks did they have into that subject matter, and where they didn't, the ballet company started to look at how they could provide those hooks through online stuff and things. Interestingly for them, only members got the stuff that would help you understand what you were looking at. But to get to a membership, you had to realize that there was a value to being a member, and so there was a real contrast there. So we started looking about how do you flip that round, like what is the value to a member and what is the value to a first-time audience, and really they started that idea of scaffolding across lots of digital platforms, all of their platforms, into giving the most basic narrative stuff, the idea of how, you know, some of the contemporary dance posters, they looked like it was going to be a traumatic experience, you know. And so it was, you know, and so they were looking at how they could demonstrate that that had something that was going to make you feel good and fun and entertaining, like that was the thing. And then when they got there, to kind of keep them back.
I think about special exhibitions or temporary exhibitions, I would ask the question, what messages are your temporary exhibitions sending to your first-time visitors? In other words, like I feel like I've had the experience, and I know many people have, of either coming into a museum or the sort of bus shelter experience where you've got the promotional poster for the special exhibition, and there's an enormous picture of, let's say, a work of art with the artist's name in gigantic letters, and you have never heard of this artist. My first reaction to that is not, ooh, I want to go. And so I think part of the question is, sometimes I think we assume a lot, and and the automatic response to I've never heard of the name of this whomever is not, and therefore I definitely want to go to find out. It's more like it must not be for me. And so I think we can't underestimate how those messages resonate and what drives people to be interested in something. You know, there's that trope about, like, if we put too much information on our website about our collections, people will have learned all about it and then they won't come. Where the opposite is true, right? The proliferation of images of the Mona Lisa has not prevented people from going to the Louvre to take a look. It's exactly the opposite. So I think familiarity, some kind of Velcro, as Peter Samus would call it, that helps people connect to the topic, the idea, the person, whatever it is. Like, I think I would want to ask the question, can your first-time visitors connect with those special exhibitions, and how might they do that? There's lots of ways of answering that question, obviously.
One of my things is, like, we really design for the people like us. Like, there is a real fear that we'll offend people who know about this stuff by talking down to them. And my overwhelming experience of people who are experienced with their organizations is they love you. They want you to, like, there are complainers, there always will be, but they are aware that there are other people with different needs. And if you can be really transparent about, this is aimed for people who are new to this topic. These are aimed at people who have never been to this museum before. That kind of really transparent pointing out, like, where those people should go that they can self-identify with, then I think that don't make them work hard to find that stuff, I think. Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you.